Maybe you've been through this before, that moment when someone from your own family looks you straight in the eye, smiles and makes you an offer that sounds just a little too good to be true. That's exactly how it all started, the plan that almost took everything from me. My name is Deborah, and what I'm about to tell you isn't some over-the-top soap opera plot, nor is it the script of a TV drama. This is real life. And it happened to me. For decades, I cared for my 40-acre farm as if it were my own child. I tilled the soil, fed the animals, paid the bills. I did it alone with sweat, courage, and without ever losing my sense of purpose. But when my son Murray showed up saying he needed to sell the farm to fund a startup called FarmFresh, everything changed. He claimed it was the future. That I was too old to understand. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about money. You're about to see how a love story for a piece of land turned into a battlefield for independence, justice, and the right to protect a legacy, and how ambition, dressed up as good intentions, can hide the most dangerous legal traps. But stay with me, because this story also has redemption, strategy, and even an adopted son flying in from Europe to bring order to the chaos. If you've ever been suspicious of an offer coming from someone who's supposed to protect you, or if you want to learn how to safeguard what's yours from family manipulation and subtle schemes, stay with me until the end. What I learned might just save you too. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because every week, you'll find stories here that inspire, warn, and above all strengthen you. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, but it no longer carried the same warmth it once did. Deborah held her coffee cup with both hands, gazing out over the rolling fields of her 40-acre farm as if trying to decipher some ancient riddle. The land was still green, the barn still stood strong, but there was something invisible in the air that made everything feel off. The soil, which once pulsed with life and purpose, now seemed to hold a strange, uncomfortable silence. And it wasn't the autumn season, it was something else. Something she didn't want to admit, yet it lingered in her mind ever since Murray's last phone call. This farm had been her entire world. She knew every bend in the land, every tree planted with her own hands, every fence repaired on cold, windy nights. And here she was, years later, feeling like a stranger in her own legacy. The unease she felt wasn't physical, it was emotional. As if the tranquility she had always known had been pulled up by the roots. The cup trembled slightly in her hands, not from weakness, but from the growing awareness of what was unfolding, the sense that her independence was at risk. For so many years, her peace had been found in the routine. Waking up early, feeding the animals, tending to the vegetable garden, listening to the old radio while cooking lunch. Deborah took pride in living simply but with dignity. She never needed applause or a spotlight. Her reward was knowing that everything around her existed because of real, honest effort. But now, it felt as if that effort was being questioned. As if, suddenly, it was an inconvenience, a property meant to be turned into an investment, profit, capital. She tried to push that thought away, turning her eyes toward the rows of corn still standing strong at the end of the season. "There's still strength here," she murmured to herself, almost like a mantra. Deep down, though, she knew the problem wasn't the land, it was the people around her. People she had raised. People she had trusted. And that's when the ground beneath her began to feel shakier than it ever had during any storm. That day, the silence across the farm weighed heavier than the sound of the tractors she knew so well. It was the kind of silence that screamed. Deborah was not the kind of woman to be easily shaken. She had survived droughts, debt, grief, and even long stretches of solitude. But this was different. This was personal. This was family. And that hurt more than any wound she could ever cover with a bandage. In the corner of the window sat an old, faded photograph back when the family was still whole. A husband, 2 young boys, and her, smiling with a slightly crooked straw hat perched on her head. A time when the farm was more than just land, it was home, it was unity. Now, only the pictures remained, along with the memories and a bitter feeling that something precious was slipping through her fingers. She knew something big was coming. And she knew she had to be ready. Because no matter how much she loved that farm, she loved the feeling of making her own decisions even more. What she had built with so much sacrifice would not be handed over on a silver platter. Not without a fight. Not without clarity. From that morning on, Deborah decided that every detail of the day would matter and that simply watching in silence would no longer be enough. The farm seemed to hold its breath with her. Even the horses appeared to sense that something was about to happen. And something was. But Deborah didn't yet know just how much her courage was about to be tested. All she knew was that, no matter how the world around her changed, she was still the owner of that land. And no son, no matter how ambitious, would take that away without facing her truth. The old landline phone rang with that familiar, dated sound she knew so well. She walked toward it with steady steps, the dish towel still draped over her shoulder. "Mom, we need to have a serious talk," Murray began without even a good morning. His voice carried urgency, the kind you hear from someone who already knows they're going to face resistance. Deborah recognized that tone instantly. It wasn't the voice of a son seeking advice. It was the voice of a man trying to close a deal. And the product he was selling was her life. Murray didn't waste a second. He launched into a speech about his startup Farm Fresh as if he were pitching to a room full of investors. "This company is going to revolutionize digitalized organic farming, Mom. But to make it happen, I need capital. And the farm, well, it's just sitting there. It could bring in millions." The words hit Deborah like a stone in the gut. Just sitting there? She woke up every morning before sunrise, cared for the land with love and attention. This wasn't some idle, stagnant asset, it was her home. "You're too emotional about this place," Murray said, as if trying to soften the blow. "But with all due respect, you're past 60. Isn't it time to start thinking about your legacy and letting the younger generation take the lead?" That was the trigger. The phrase "too old to understand dreams" came out like an arrow, wrapped in a polite tone but laced with condescension, as if his dream was more valid than hers, as if Deborah had suddenly become a burden to someone else's version of success. She didn't answer right away. She let the silence do its work. Murray kept talking, each new line sounding more rehearsed than the last. There was a script there: sell the idea as something good, convince her it was a favor, then pile on guilt about not standing in the way of your children's future. It was a blend of family manipulation dressed up in the shiny language of modern business. But deep down, Deborah could smell what it really was: an attempt to erase her story in the name of a promise that didn't even exist yet. The call lasted about 7 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Murray wrapped it up with a casual, "Just think about it, okay?" As if he'd just offered her an irresistible deal. Deborah hung up without committing either way. Her only reply was, "We'll see." But inside, she already knew. This wasn't just some reckless idea from an overeager son. This was the start of steady, mounting pressure and effort to convince her that what she had built with her own hands should be traded for a dream that wasn't hers. She returned to the kitchen, taking a slow, deep breath. The smell of coffee still lingered in the air, but it no longer brought comfort the way it once did. For the first time, she felt that Murray no longer saw her as a mother but as an obstacle. The pain was subtle, yet deep. And somewhere inside her chest, an old wound began to reopen, the feeling of being disposable. As if, after all this time, she was just the lady with the farm, who now needed to let the younger ones handle things. Deborah pulled out a chair and sat down at the kitchen table. She glanced at her to-do list for the day, but her mind wouldn't focus. Murray's request wasn't just about finances. It was symbolic. It represented a break, a disconnect between generations. And maybe, the confirmation of something she had been avoiding. Not all children understand the value of things that can't be bought. But she wasn't the kind to give in easily. She knew that phone call was only the first of many attempts. And from that moment on, she would need to be more alert than ever. This wasn't just about protecting the farm. It was about protecting herself. And with that, the legacy she had sacrificed so much to build. That same afternoon, Deborah allowed herself to sit on the wooden porch swing. There, with the chirping of crickets setting the tone for the early evening, she sank into her memories. It was impossible to look at any corner of her 40-acre farm without seeing a chapter of her life. The fence in the back? Repaired on the very day she lost her husband. The jabuticaba tree beside the chicken coop? Planted with the help of her young sons after an especially hard summer. Those memories weren't just stored in her mind, they were rooted deep in the land. She remembered vividly the first day she set foot there as the sole owner, no longer just the wife. Her husband had died suddenly, a heart attack that came without warning. The neighbors whispered, "She'll sell everything and move to the city." But Deborah stayed. Because even in her grief, she knew this was where her strength would grow. And that's exactly what happened. She learned to operate the machinery, negotiate with suppliers, deal with farm taxes. And she did it all while raising 2 boys who depended on her more than ever. It wasn't uncommon for her to spend nights wide awake, going over accounts by lamplight while the boys slept in the next room. Was she afraid? Yes. But fear was never enough to make her give up. The farm wasn't just an asset, it was her anchor, her compass. When money got tight, she sold homemade jam at the town fair. When there was no one to help with the labor, she did it herself. She never complained. She just kept moving forward. With faith. With focus. With the certainty that this wasn't sacrifice, it was choice. Family manipulation was not something she had expected to face again after all these years. But that call from Murray had stirred something old and familiar, the realization that no matter how much you build, some people will still see you as weak because you're a woman, because you're a mother, because you've passed 60. But she knew that was just a convenient narrative for those who wanted to take without fighting for it. Protecting what's yours takes more than courage, it takes memory. Because it's only by remembering where you've come from that you truly understand the value of what you have. She thought back to stormy nights spent locked in the barn with her boys, cracking jokes to hide the fear. To winter mornings when the well water was so cold it ached in her bones, yet she pushed through anyway. Each of those moments was a brick in the invisible wall she had built inside herself. That's why, when someone came along talking about innovation and modern proposals, she listened politely but analyzed carefully. Experience teaches you to spot a scam even when it comes wrapped in a smile. The strongest memory of all, though, was the promise she had once made to herself: this land will only move forward, never backward. It wasn't about irrational attachment, it was about respect. About protecting a place that had fed generations. That had built character. That had taught her the difference between ownership and belonging. So when Deborah heard Murray say it was just idle land, she didn't feel offended, she felt challenged. And she had never run from a challenge. As the swing creaked softly beneath her, she thought about all the advice she had given over the years to neighbors, to Coop colleagues, even to young entrepreneurs who came seeking inspiration. She always told them, never sign anything you don't understand. And never sell what you still love. Now, it was time to take her own advice. To honor her journey. And above all, to prove to herself that she was still in control. With that in mind, she decided to open the old desk drawer and go through the farm documents. Deeds, certificates, records, each one kept with the same care you'd give to a sacred inheritance. Because that's exactly what she was defending now. This wasn't just a matter of property. It was a matter of identity. As she sifted through the papers in the desk, Deborah found an old letter. The handwriting was steady, deliberate. It was from Dustin, her eldest son. Adopted when he was just a little boy from a nearby shelter, he had always been the most level-headed, the most thoughtful. He hadn't been born from her body, but from her heart. And in so many moments of her life, it was Dustin who had stood beside her, quietly holding things together. A son who never needed to prove himself, yet always gave more than anyone expected. She read the letter slowly. It was one of those he had sent back when he lived in London, studying law on a merit scholarship. It said something like, "Mom, every time I feel like I don't belong anywhere, I think of the smell of wet earth on the farm. It reminds me of who I am." Deborah smiled, her eyes welling up. Unlike Murray, who seemed eager to erase his roots in order to build something new, Dustin held on tightly to where he came from. He valued it. He protected it. The difference between the two brothers had always been clear. Murray was pure ambition, Dustin was balance. One could sell any idea, the other would question it until it made sense. Murray wanted to soar high often without watching where he stepped. Dustin preferred to build the ladder one rung at a time. And that made all the difference now. Because Deborah knew that if Dustin were around, this conversation about selling the farm wouldn't even survive the first sentence. She remembered how Dustin used to help with the farm chores, even on days when he had exams. He never complained. He always found a way to solve problems with intelligence. It was him who created the farm's first drip irrigation system using recycled tubing and an old water pump. He was resourceful, observant. He didn't care about being in the spotlight. And it was precisely that quiet nature that made his actions speak louder than words. Deborah knew that if it were up to Murray, she would already be signing a contract right now, one filled with vague clauses and technical jargon, a legal labyrinth designed to confuse and persuade. But Dustin read between the lines. He was the kind of man who wouldn't miss a single comma. And that was exactly what she needed right now, someone who not only understood the law, but understood values. Justice. Loyalty. No matter how much she loved both her sons, Deborah knew one of them still saw the farm as fertile ground. The other saw it as a liquid asset. And that was the difference between protecting a legacy and cashing in on it. She didn't want to create a family war, that was never her aim. But she also wasn't about to be manipulated in the name of a promising future that was, in truth, nothing more than an elegant con. She had learned long ago that the worst betrayal is the one wrapped in good intentions. That night, before going to sleep, she picked up her cell phone and looked at Dustin's last message. It had been almost 3 weeks. A photo of a market in Prague, captioned, "Imagine a little market like this on the farm?" Yes, he had ideas, but they were ideas that included her story, her way of doing things, the very essence of the farm. Not plans that would rip out the roots just to plant profit in their place. That made all the difference now. Lying there in her old wooden bed, Deborah made a quiet decision. If things got more serious, if the pressure mounted, she would call Dustin. Because despite the physical distance, he was the only one who truly understood what that land meant. And more than that, he was the only one who would never ask her to give something up just so he could look successful on LinkedIn. It was a clear Tuesday morning when Deborah decided to meet Sadie at Benson's Corner, the oldest coffee shop in town. A place that smelled of fresh cheese, bread, and nostalgia. She arrived early, as she always did, and chose a table by the window. When Sadie walked in, dressed in an expensive blazer and carrying a leather portfolio, Deborah already knew this wasn't going to be just a casual chat between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. There was something more here. Something rehearsed. And unfortunately, Deborah had seen this kind of theater before. Sadie smiled, sat down confidently, and ordered a sugar-free cappuccino. "Debbie, Murray and I have been thinking a lot about the farm lately," she began, with that syrupy tone Deborah had always found artificial. Then she pulled out a glossy brochure with the title Farm Fresh Experience. The proposal? To transform the farm into a commercial and tourist hub complete with an organic restaurant, a farmer's market, rural events, and even a wedding venue. All packaged as a modern dream with disruptive potential. Deborah listened in silence. Sadie spoke with excitement, the kind of excitement someone has when pitching a brilliant idea to a stubborn investor. But between the lines, Deborah saw the gaps. The project was too ambitious, too expensive, too generic. There was little connection to the history of the place, and far too much emphasis on expansion opportunities and brand monetization. This wasn't about caring for the land. It was about exploiting it. And that made Deborah's fingers tighten around her cup. Sadie tried to play the emotional card. She talked about how Murray had always admired his mother, how they wanted to preserve the family name and modernize without erasing the past. But the more she spoke, the more the scent of a con grew stronger. It was the oldest trick in the book: use sweet words to hide a plan that, in reality, would strip Deborah of all control over the farm. She kept her expression calm, simply watching. And when Sadie noticed the silence, she pulled her final move. Of course, you'd still have a share, Debbie. But we'd be in charge. After all, you deserve to rest, right? Rest. That word landed like an insult. Who decides when she rests? Who gets to declare her time is over? Deborah took a deep breath. She thought about how many women like her had been pushed off their own path under the pretense of help. But this wasn't help. This was a gift-wrapped proposal with an instruction manual that would remove her from every decision. Sadie might have studied business, but she knew nothing about respect. Deborah feigned interest, took the brochures, and thanked her politely. Sadie, pleased, thought she had planted a seed. What she didn't know was that the conversation had achieved the exact opposite. It had confirmed the real intentions. This wasn't about legacy. It was about control. And when ambition mixes with family manipulation, what grows from it isn't partnership, it's conflict. Deborah had seen this movie before. But this time, she knew exactly how to respond. On the drive home, the brochures lay on the passenger seat. Her stomach churned with each passing mile. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became this proposal was a trap dressed as an opportunity. And more than that, Murray wasn't working alone. Sadie had a voice, a strategic role, and possibly even more ambition than he did. They were playing as a team, and this time, the prize was the farm. But she wasn't about to hand them the trophy. When she got home, she tossed the brochures onto the living room table. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. Now, everything was crystal clear. What had started as an uneasy feeling was now confirmed. This wasn't a beautiful project. It was a plan to push her out. And as painful as it was to admit, Deborah knew she had to act fast before their farm fresh experience turned into a reality that would be nearly impossible to reverse. The next morning, Deborah woke up earlier than usual. She brewed her coffee, fed the animals, but kept the farm fresh experience brochures spread open on the living room table. She read every line with a sharpened focus, not as an emotional mother, but as an experienced manager. And there, tucked between paragraphs loaded with buzzwords and vague promises, she found what was really going on. This wasn't an invitation to modernize, it was a carefully disguised takeover. There were technical terms hidden in the fine print: partial transfer of ownership, consultative vote, performance clause. Deborah might not have a college degree, but years of dealing with supplier contracts and bank loans had given her a sharp eye. She understood immediately that this wasn't about creating a tourist destination. It was about putting her in a decorative, powerless position while Murray and Sadie took over legally. The family manipulation had evolved. It was more sophisticated now. And ironically, by signing those papers, she'd be authorizing her own exclusion. The more she read, the more the questions burned in her mind. How could Murray do this? How could someone who grew up watching her work tirelessly, day after day, think it was fair to trap her in something like this? And Sadie's role was even more calculated. She was the one preparing the documents, talking to lawyers, setting the stage. She wasn't just a daughter-in-law. She was an accomplice. And that, for Deborah, hurt more than any tricky clause in a contract. It was the sting of betrayal from within her own family. A memory surfaced of a neighbor who had lost her farm after trusting her son-in-law too much, signing documents she didn't understand. Deborah had been the one to help that woman get back on her feet, organizing fairs and coup contacts for her. Back then, Deborah had made herself a promise she would never let that happen to her. And here she was now, staring at a plan so well disguised that, without her sharp instincts, she might have fallen for it like a rookie. But she hadn't. If anything, this had woken her up. She picked up the phone, but she didn't call Murray. She called the family's accountant. She asked him to review all farm records from the past 10 years and to run a full analysis of the farm fresh proposal. "I need to know if this smells like a scam," she said, her voice steady. She knew he wasn't a lawyer, but it was a good starting point. What she needed now was solid information to face whatever was coming. That afternoon, a friend from the coop called. She had heard about the project. "It's beautiful. You're going to be famous, Debs," she said, excited. Deborah thanked her but didn't explain a thing. It wasn't time yet. What others saw as glamour, Deborah already recognized as a trap. And what scared her most was knowing that Murray was using her image as bait. Family farm, emotional story, inspiring matriarch. All a facade. Deborah was the marketing. But the control that was being quietly drained away. At dusk, she walked into the barn and looked at the old equipment. A tractor Murray had helped paint as a child. A barrel stamped with the logo Dustin had designed as a teenager. And then, like a sudden crack of lightning, it hit her. Murray didn't want to preserve the farm, he wanted to use it as a stepping stone. And once he was done, he'd leave it behind like just another rung on his ladder. That was it. He didn't see roots here. He saw nothing but financial potential. And as cruel as it felt to admit, it was time to accept that truth. Deborah walked back to the house with a new kind of strength in her chest. Her decision was already made, there would be no deal, no sale. But she also knew she couldn't just respond with emotion, she had to move strategically. Because what was at stake was far bigger than a piece of land. It was her entire life story being threatened. And the only way to protect it was to prepare for the battle that was now inevitable. The following Saturday, Deborah was in the barn organizing feed sacks when her phone buzzed with a message. "Mom, well, stop by tomorrow. We've got some alternative proposals to discuss. Nothing big, just a few preliminary documents. It'll be good for everyone." It was from Murray, of course. Short, direct, rehearsed. The use of English business terms, alternative proposals, preliminary documents, felt like he was trying to give authority to an idea that was already born suspicious. Deborah read the message twice, slowly. By now, she knew this wasn't just a casual Sunday visit. This was a carefully planned move. They would come armed with smiles, technical terms, and probably some informal lawyer disguised as a consultant. She knew the script by heart. First comes the charm, then the insistence, and finally the contract. But this time, she would be ready. Her reply was simple: "All right. See you at 4 p.m. On the outside, she appeared calm. Inside, she was alert. Every nerve was tuned. She had no doubt this was no family meeting. This was an attempt at a takeover. And if they thought she was going to be caught off guard, they were about to learn that Deborah, the woman who had faced storms, loss, loneliness, and the grind of decades of hard work, still knew how to fight for what was hers. That night, as she went over the farm's documents once again, Deborah set aside a large brown envelope containing every historical record she owned, the original deed, every amendment over the years, maintenance receipts, and even a detailed map marking every boundary. She knew that if anyone tried to push something through, she would have the grounds to counter it. Still, she felt she needed reinforcement. And there was only one person she truly trusted in a situation like this: Dustin. Without a second thought, she picked up her phone and called his number in Europe. She needed to hear his voice. She needed to tell him everything before this so-called family meeting turned into a full-blown trap. But the call rang until it went to voicemail. Frustrated, she took a deep breath, picked up her phone again, and sent a message: "Son, I need to talk to you. It's about the farm. Urgent." She hit send and set the phone down on the couch. For the first time in years, Deborah felt the tension climbing up into her shoulders. The next day, she woke up earlier than usual. She cleaned the house carefully, not out of vanity, but because she knew every detail would count. They would be watching everything: the condition of the property, her routine, even her gestures. It was part of the game. Sadie was a specialist at twisting context to fit her narrative. "See how hard it is for her to handle all this on her own," would be the likely line. And that was why Deborah made sure to project the opposite: firmness, organization, autonomy. By 350 p.m. everything was ready. The table was set with freshly brewed coffee, corn cake the kind Sadie always complimented, and an air of normality that masked the tension in the room. At exactly 400, the imported car rolled through the gate. Murray and Sadie stepped out with bright smiles, false embraces, quick compliments. "You look beautiful, Mom." "This house is so charming, isn't it, honey? What a wonderful smell." Deborah knew it was all part of the show, but she let them perform. The more they talked, the more they revealed their script. Right after the greetings came the pitch. "We brought some new ideas. Nothing official, of course, but we'd love to hear your opinion." Sadie opened the leather portfolio with the same care as if she were serving the main course at a business dinner. The papers had charts, tables, and even a profit projection. Deborah pretended to be interested, took the first document, and said nothing. She read slowly. One of the sheets already had a space for a signature. "Just to register your interest," Sadie said casually. But Deborah knew this was the opening move of a legal trap. She stood, walked to the bookshelf, and brought back a notepad. "Let's jot down a few questions before signing anything, shall we?" she said with a light but firm smile. Marie's expression changed for just a second, a flicker of discomfort. They hadn't expected immediate resistance. They hadn't expected her to be ready. But here she was, pen in hand, prepared to turn their stage play into a courtroom. And in that moment, she knew she wasn't alone. Even without an answer yet, she knew Dustin would see the message. And when he did, he would come. Because he understood what that farm meant, and above all, he could spot a con, even when it came dressed in letterhead and sweet words. The morning after the so-called family meeting, Deborah's phone vibrated on the kitchen table. It was a video call from Dustin. Her heart skipped. She answered quickly, trying to steady her breathing. On the other side, the pixelated image of a room in Prague appeared on the screen. "Mom, I saw your message. What's going on?" His voice, even from miles away, carried that unique blend of calm and urgency. Deborah took a deep breath and told him everything, every detail, from the farm-fresh pitch to the documents with signature lines already in place. Dustin listened in silence. He didn't interrupt. Just nodded occasionally, jotting notes into a notebook. When she finished, he didn't hesitate. "Mom, this is a legal trap. And a good one." He explained that this kind of preliminary document could still be used to legitimize business intentions and fast-track asset transfer processes. If you sign anything that signals intent to enter into a business arrangement even without direct value, they can position you into a hard-to-reverse legal situation. Especially if it's tied to side contracts you haven't even seen yet. A chill ran down Deborah's spine. It was exactly what she feared, but hearing it from Dustin brought a cold clarity. "They've prepared this strategically," he continued. "And they're using the family connection to speed up your acceptance. This is emotional manipulation with legal teeth." Harsh words but necessary. Dustin, now a trained lawyer with experience in contract law, didn't see a family proposal. He saw a structured takeover operation. He asked her to scan every document she had received. "Send them now. I need to analyze everything today. I know this pattern." Deborah didn't argue. With him, there was no improvisation, only analysis, evidence, legal footing. And for the first time in days, she felt a thread of relief. Not because the problem was gone, but because she finally had someone on her side with the right tools to face the enemy, even if that enemy shared her blood. Before ending the call, Dustin told her, "I'm leaving Prague tonight. There's a flight to New York with a short layover, then straight to Brazil. I'll be there in 2 days." Deborah tried to protest. "Son, you don't have to drop everything for this." But he cut her off, firm. "Of course I do. This farm is more mine than it is for some people there. And you, Mom, you are my most valuable asset. I'm not letting this turn into a court case. I'm going to handle it personally." When the call ended, Deborah felt a mix of relief and guilt. Relief for having support. Guilt for having to call someone from so far away to help fix something that, in theory, should have been simple, protecting what's yours. But deep down, she knew she was right to ask for help. Being independent doesn't mean never asking for backup, it means knowing when to fight alone and when to build a strong defense. That afternoon, she called the accountant again and cancelled any future meetings with Murray and Sadie. "We'll only resume discussions once my son is present. And with a lawyer in the room." The accountant, discreet as ever, understood the message. Deborah was taking her position. And this time, she had backup. No more fake smiles. No more alternative proposals. From now on, it was a war of documents. And she had a general she could trust. 2 days later, Dustin arrived on a humid Wednesday afternoon, carrying a small suitcase and a leather briefcase he held as if it were a weapon. Deborah welcomed him with a long, silent embrace, the kind that needed no words. It was more than missing him, it was relief. Over coffee, he got straight to the point. "Mom, what you're dealing with isn't just a business move. It's a deliberate attempt at dismantling your estate through family influence. And that's more common than people think." Deborah frowned. She had never thought of it in those terms, but it made perfect sense. They weren't trying to help her evolve, they were trying to dismantle her history under the guise of modernization. They spent hours in the dining room, now turned into a war room. Dustin organized the documents into piles: legal, financial, and emotional. Yes, even that mattered to him. "We need to prepare for 3 fronts: emotional, legal, and narrative. They'll try to destabilize you first, then confuse you, and finally convince you," he explained. Deborah listened carefully, impressed by her son's precision. At that table, he wasn't just a lawyer, he was a son who knew the game inside and out. In the legal pile, Dustin pointed out clauses about property use concessions, early inheritance arrangements, and even a rebranding plan that included changing the farm's registered name. "This here is the Trojan horse," he said. "Once you sign this, you become a minority partner with no veto power." Deborah swallowed hard. She had suspected it, but hearing it so plainly was painful. "The good news," Dustin continued, "is that nothing has been signed yet. And the property is still 100 in your name, with a clean deed. We have room to maneuver." That night, they created a plan of action. At the next meeting with Murray and Sadie, Dustin would attend not as the beloved son visiting from Europe, but as his mother's legal counsel. Formal. Uncompromising. Deborah hesitated for a moment. "Won't they say we're overreacting?" Dustin didn't miss a beat. "Of course they will. But overreaction, Mom, is what they've been doing. We're just responding proportionately." The next day, they started building the narrative. Deborah wrote down in a notebook everything she wanted to say. "I'm not going to let them silence me with contracts," she murmured. Dustin coached her the way a lawyer prepares a key witness. Steady eyes. Clear words. You're not justifying yourself, you're reaffirming your rights. It was like training for a duel. A modern one, fought with words and evidence instead of swords. She also made sure to prepare herself emotionally. She went to bed early, drank chamomile tea, and lit an incense stick Dustin had given her years ago. "They're going to try to shake me. But I'm whole," she repeated to herself. And she truly was stronger than she had been in weeks. Because now she had an ally who not only understood how the world worked, but who genuinely cared about her, not about what he could take from her. Meanwhile, Dustin discreetly messaged colleagues in the legal field back in Brazil, requesting technical reviews of the contracts and drafting an informal legal opinion. If needed, he'd take it further in court. But for now, it was enough to show that they knew the game and that this time, Deborah was neither alone nor uninformed. She was in attack position. On the eve of the meeting, they walked together to the far edge of the crops. It was an old tradition. Deborah stopped, looked around and said, "I built this with love. I'm not letting anyone take it away from me," with letterhead and fine print. Dustin smiled, squeezed her shoulder, and replied, "And they won't, Mom. Because now, you're surrounded not by promises but by proof." Sunday afternoon came quietly, but the silence in Deborah's home was not the tense kind, it was the kind that comes with readiness. The coffee was brewed, the table set, but unlike the previous meeting, this time there was an extra chair at the table occupied by Dustin, sitting with the posture of a lawyer in court. Murray and Sadie arrived with the same rehearsed smiles, but quickly realized the atmosphere had changed. This was not going to be disguised as a family talk. Sadie was the first to notice Dustin's leather briefcase in front of him. "Good to see you, Dust. We didn't know you were in Brazil." He replied simply, "I came for the farm." Short, direct. Deborah stayed silent, but there was something in her expression that made it clear she was no longer the hesitant woman from their last meeting. There was a new glint of confidence in her eyes, and Sadie noticed. Murray, on the other hand, looked uneasy. Dustin asked to begin with the proposal from the previous meeting. In a calm, professional tone, he explained that he had reviewed every clause and found serious issues. This property restructuring proposal poses significant legal risks, including violations of basic principles protecting family-owned assets. He then listed the points clauses for partial transfer without a guaranteed return, use of the farm's image in marketing campaigns without the owner's consent, and ties to companies registered under third-party names. Murray tried to cut in. "Calm down, this is just a proposal. We haven't even formalized it yet." Dustin was quick. "And that's exactly why it's dangerous. Because what's presented as preliminary often ends up being the first step into a binding legal commitment. And you know that, Murray." The direct mention of his brother's name, in the sharp tone of both a lawyer and a son, shifted the energy in the room completely. Deborah, silent until then, simply nodded. Sadie, trying to regain control, switched tactics. "The idea was to enhance what your mother built. Turn it into something modern, profitable, nationally recognized." Deborah smiled and finally spoke. "Sadie, what I built here doesn't need makeup to have value. It needs respect. And that's what was missing." Murray exhaled sharply, clearly impatient. "Mom, you're holding on to a romantic idea of legacy. The world has changed." Deborah's voice remained steady. "Yes, the world has changed. But I'm still the owner of this land. And the only one who decides what changes here is me." Dustin then presented documents he had drafted himself, securing Deborah's full rights over the farm, including an official legal notice that would prevent any sale or transfer attempts without her formal, written consent. From now on, any proposal must be formally submitted and reviewed by a legal representative. Otherwise, it will be considered an attempt at coercion over her assets. Sadie's expression shifted instantly. The message was clear: the game was over. The air in the room grew heavy. Murray made one last attempt to appeal to her. "You're going to throw away an opportunity just because you don't want to leave your comfort zone?" Deborah stood up, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "I'm not in a comfort zone, son. I'm at the center of my own story. And you just try to erase it with a pen." Silence. Sadie closed her folder. Murray rose from his chair. Neither of them said another word. Before they left, Dustin added, "Justice starts at home. And if necessary, it will end in court." The words landed like a gavel. Deborah walked them to the door. There was no anger, no shouting, just a steady certainty, rooted deep like an old tree. She had taken back control. After they left, the air in the house felt different, lighter, cleaner. Deborah closed the door slowly, without hurry, as if sealing a chapter. The coffee on the table remained untouched, but she didn't mind. This meeting had never been about hospitality, it was about reclaiming what they had tried to take without a fight. For the first time in weeks, she felt she had won, not by shouting louder, but by being more prepared. She gathered the documents from the table and placed them carefully in a folder. The act, almost ritualistic, was more than organization. It was a promise to herself that nothing would ever be signed again under pressure or emotional manipulation. She knew the real danger wasn't in the papers themselves, but in the hidden intentions behind them. And protecting herself from that was, above all, an act of courage. That afternoon, she walked out to the old barn and stood there for a few minutes in silence. The sound of the wind between the wooden boards, the familiar smell of hay and timber, everything seemed to confirm what she already knew: the farm was still hers. Not just on paper, but in essence, in control, in destiny. She hadn't just avoided a legal trap, she had reaffirmed herself as the protagonist of a story many had tried to relegate to a footnote. When she returned to the house, she found Dustin bent over the desk, reviewing more documents. "Son, it's over. You don't need to keep it this tonight." He smiled, relieved. "I'm just finalizing the preventive notice. I want to make sure they think twice before coming back with another move." Deborah walked over and rested her hand on his shoulder. "You saved me." He looked at her and replied, "You were already safe, Mom. You just needed backup." That moment meant more than any contract. The next morning, Deborah posted a notice in the Coop group. "I inform you that Monte Sereno Farm remains 100 under my direct management. Any proposal, investment, or future activity will be discussed solely with me." It was like lighting a beacon in the fog, a clear, public, and non-negotiable message. The community understood. And, more importantly, they respected it. Many praised her firmness. Others simply stayed quiet, but with the kind of respect you earn, not demand. In the days that followed, she reorganized her schedule with clarity. She reconnected with old suppliers, reviewed the finances, renewed contracts with local workers. But most importantly, she took time for herself again. She went back to reading in the late afternoons, walking the fields without hurry, tending to the plants with a lighter spirit. Not because she was ignoring the risks, but because she had already beaten the greatest one, the risk of losing her own voice. Murray tried contacting her by text a few times, but Deborah chose not to respond, at least for now. She knew wounds don't close with generic apologies, they need time, reflection, and concrete actions. Sadie, on the other hand, gave no sign at all. And perhaps that was for the best. Some relationships, when broken in such a calculated way, don't deserve repair, they deserve distance. One night, as she sat on the porch under a sky full of stars, Deborah reflected in silence. This wasn't just about property. It was about independence, about never allowing even poorly managed love to become a weapon against her own story. And maybe that was the greatest lesson of all: protecting your legacy is not selfishness. It's wisdom. The next morning, the sunlight came through the kitchen window differently. Sitting with her favorite ceramic mug, Deborah wasn't thinking about documents, traps, or hidden clauses anymore. She was thinking about plans, not someone else's, but her own. For the first time in a long time, she felt the future was back in her hands. And with it, the freedom to choose, not out of pressure, but out of conviction. That 40-acre farm would not be sold, exploited, or transformed. It would be cared for, lived in, and honored. Just as it always had been. Dustin stayed in Brazil for a few more days, and the two of them used that time not just to tie up loose ends, but to dream together. "Mom, what if we created something here, but our way?" he suggested one afternoon. Deborah chuckled. "Our way meaning without influencers staging fake picnics in the middle of the fields, right?" They both laughed. That was how she wanted things, with truth. With roots. With soul. They began sketching ideas that made sense, nothing grandiose, just initiatives that honored the place, its history, and the culture of the farm. Small writing retreats, agroecology events, even a school visitation program. Something that would unite learning, experience, and respect for the land. "If we open the gates, let it be to plant more good people, not to harvest vanity," Deborah said, jotting the thought in her notebook. That was how she dreamed, feet on the ground, heart at peace. At the Coop, many came to comment on the family restructuring. While some still whispered, most now looked at Deborah with a new kind of admiration. She had become a reference not for rigidity, but for firmness laced with kindness. "You didn't let anyone take what's yours." "That's inspiring," said a younger producer. It was true. Deborah had become a symbol of quiet resistance and active wisdom, not someone who fought for ego, but someone who protected what carried history. One afternoon, Dustin suggested formally registering a preservation plan for the property, a family intent document ensuring that, even in the future, the farm could never be sold or altered without the express approval of the matriarch. "It's a way to keep your wishes on record, even when you're no longer here," he explained. Deborah nodded. "But I hope to be around for quite a few decades yet," she replied with a wry smile. Deep down, though, she knew she was locking her story in place for the generations to come. On a quiet Sunday, while watering the garden, Deborah realized something inside her had shifted. Fear had turned into presence. Insecurity had become strategy. Doubt had transformed into resolve. More than that, she had rediscovered the joy of caring for her own life with emotional authority. She didn't have to prove anything to anyone, only live in peace with the choices she made every day. "Murray?" He remained silent. And though part of her still felt the sting of disappointment, another part understood that not everyone is ready to see the value of roots. Some would rather fly even without direction. And that was fine. Deborah bore no ill will, held no grudges. But she would never again leave the door open for history to repeat itself. Protecting it was now her commitment to herself and to everything she had built. And so, on that farm so many had tried to take, something new was born. Not a startup, nor a tourist attraction, but a new phase of life, free, seasoned, and decisive. A future not dictated by trends or pressure, but guided by someone who truly understood the value of every piece of land. And every line of that story was written by her. Deborah's story might not have helicopters, explosive twists, or cartoonish villains. But it carries something many real stories have, and few are brave enough to tell: the weight of being betrayed by someone you love, and the greatness of still standing afterward. It wasn't just a farm that almost got lost. It was a woman who had nearly signed away her voice under sweet words and questionable intentions. But she didn't. And that changes everything. How many times have you doubted your own abilities just because someone made you feel outdated? How many times have you been convinced that they know better just because they spoke smoothly or showed you a flashy PowerPoint full of promises? Deborah shows us that experience is worth as much as any degree. That legacy isn't just about property, it's about the courage to protect what you've built, even when the attack comes from inside your own home. Throughout her journey, we saw something much bigger than an inheritance dispute or a land fight. What was at stake was the autonomy of a woman who refused to be pushed out of her own story. And that's what makes this journey so powerful: the reaffirmation that no one has the right to decide your future for you, not a son, not a business partner, not a piece of paper full of disguised clauses. Let's be honest, it's painful to admit that someone you raised with love can use that love as a tool for manipulation. But it's necessary. Because ignoring the trap doesn't protect you from it. Deborah faced it head-on. And in doing so, she taught all of us a lesson worth more than any farm. Protecting your independence is just as vital as protecting your health, your dignity, your peace. Maybe you're living something similar. It could be a relative trying to make decisions for you. A business partner trying to edge you out of your own company. A spouse telling you that you don't understand the modern world. And maybe, deep down, you've started to believe it. Don't. Remember Deborah. Remember the woman who held the pen firmly and said, "I'm not signing my way out of my own life." She didn't win because she shouted. She won because she prepared. She studied. She asked for help. She faced the fear. And above all, because she knew when to stop explaining and start setting boundaries. The world might try to push those who are older, or simply live differently, to the sidelines. But those with strong roots aren't toppled by a light wind. It takes a storm. And even then, sometimes the tree stands. So I'll leave you with a few questions. Who is in control of your story today, you or someone else? Do you still recognize the person who looks back at you in the mirror every morning? Or are you living a narrative someone else wrote for you? There's still time to change it. There always is. As long as you have the courage to say enough and start writing the script with your own hands again. If this story resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your comment. Tell me, have you ever had to protect something that was yours from someone who claimed to have your best interest at heart? And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because every week, you'll find stories here that inspire, warn, and above all strengthen you. Protecting your legacy is your responsibility. But never forget, you are not alone.